All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Infinity and Beyond panel, learning how to leverage deaf gain as an asset for your company. I'd like to begin by thanking our four sponsors, Gallaudet University, Communication Services for the Deaf, National Association for the Deaf, Rochester Institute for Technology, and National Technical Institute for the Deaf. Thank you for your support. I'm Dr. Daniel Lundberg, and I'll be moderating today. I'm so grateful to have our three panelists with us. Unfortunately, our fourth had a last-minute situation arise and was unable to join us today. First, we have Vicky Garcia, an aerospace engineer and a team lead in Team Space organization. Hi, Vicky. Next, we have Eric Shear, space scientist and chemical engineer in academia in collaboration with the energy industry. Thank you for joining us, Eric. And Apurva Varia. Apurva is a mission operation director in a space organization. I'd also like to thank our team working behind the scenes. If not for them, this would not have been possible. Thank you, each and every one of you. For audience members, if you have any questions during the presentation, please enter them in the Q&A. Those questions will be shared with me, and I will then share them with the panelists. Following the conclusion of the panel and presentation, we will be sending resources out to all registrants of today's panel with further information. At this time, we have a poll for our audience. If you'll take a look in the chat box and click the link and answer the questions in the poll, please. And while we're waiting for that, let's begin with a few questions. I'll ask the questions. Feel free, any of our panelists, to answer them. What has your journey in Infinity and Beyond looked like?
Can I go first?
Sure.
Well, Eric, it looks like you're ready to go, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. So I actually began in community college. I'm from Washington State, and I began my experience studying mechanical engineering at a community college there for the first 2 years. Then I applied for experimental sciences at NASA, was accepted to join a flight on a weightless water capsule. And for this, I was doing experiments, and that was 2011. Following that, I transferred to York University in Toronto, Canada, studying physics and astrophysics. I received my bachelor's and master's there. I also wrote 2 peer reviews, 2 journal articles as both an undergraduate and graduate student. And through that experience, I developed an interest in humans in flight, and that led me to chemical engineering, which then led me to my second bachelor's from the University of Northern Florida. I've graduated from there, and I am currently working at a partnership between University of Northern Florida and the energy industry, looking at waste. With Astro Access, I actually have been on 2 voyages with them in 2021 and 2022. So I've been on 3 weightless flights now.
You know, that's pretty impressive because I'm pretty sure I'd chicken out. Turbulence is not something that I'm a fan of. Vicky?
Sure. So my journey was a bit of the unexpected. I was actually born in Miami, Florida. And my parents are from Cuba. They knew nothing about math, engineering, anything like that. They worked in finance. So I liked math. I liked science. I did have interests in those areas. And then in high school, I tried to figure out what to do. I started off in one field and then I changed to a different one, like criminal justice, investigating crime, and just trying to think of what I wanted to do with my future. And my path changed a few times. It came to a point where I decided I wanted to study computer sciences. And at first I thought, I'll work hard and, become comfortable in an area, sitting at a desk. And will I really try new things? Will I really want to leave my comfort zone? So I decided to step outside of my comfort zone at that time. And I really stepped into a whole new world, a whole new experience. And in fact, my comfort zone grew. And I have studied aerospace. Once I completed college, I applied for a summer internship. And that summer internship focused on people with disabilities. And I knew I wanted to be hired and recognized as a hard worker and not because I was deaf, which feels a bit strange, but that was how I felt. So I decided to go ahead and apply. And through this experience, it really opened the door for me. It gave me the opportunity to work in the aerospace and industry. And I never really thought this was something I would get into. I thought it was more along the lines of airplanes and helicopters and that sort of thing. But I thought, I'll try. It's a new experience, a new opportunity. Why?
Just then I decided to work at the space organization where I work today. Good afternoon, everybody. For me, when I was in the 6th grade, around 11 or 12 years old, I would watch things on TV that piqued my interest. And there was one event in particular that looked like a space shuttle launch. And I was so fascinated by that. And just seeing the people get ready to enter the shuttle, I think I saw 7 different people wearing spacesuits, and I was just puzzled as to why they looked that way and what they were doing, how they were entering the shuttle. And then I noticed that there was a countdown, and I gradually became more excited. And finally, it was 3, 2, 1 liftoff, and I was just so excited. And that's something that really inspired me to be an astronaut. And I thought to myself, who can I contact, at NASA? And I wrote a letter to NASA and I waited a period of time. And to my surprise, there was something that I received in a brown envelope from them. And when I looked at it, they said that they weren't ready to accept any deaf astronauts at this time. And, I was taken aback by that. And I gave it some further thought and decided I wouldn't let that stop me from achieving my dreams. So I decided to become an engineer. I always loved building Legos, and I was really fascinated by putting things together. So it made sense for me to be an engineer. I attended Rochester Institute of Technology for mechanical engineering. And there are various organizations in NASA that I was able to partner with in that time. And then I got my master's in bioengineering. And then I was able to get a job in a public office. And my dream was nearly true because I was able to build myself up to the point where I'm able to access these spaces that, astronauts are in.
Wow. Legos, building with blocks, and then that becoming your dream. Lovely. So with our poll results, we can see 39% of our audience members are a part of the deaf and hard of hearing community. 42% are employed, 20% are students.
That's really good.
Thank you for those. Second question. Can you describe some employment barriers you've overcome to make it this far?
I can speak to that. I'll go first.
Sure.
So at my very first job, it was actually at Target, but it was really tough. I had to communicate by writing back and forth, and I had to do, stocking and put things on the shelves. And it was really tough to communicate, having to write back and forth. And I'll be honest, I didn't do very well at it just because I didn't have much experience and the communication barriers. So after 2 months, I was fired from my job. It made me think about what I really want from a job. I wanted a job where I could communicate with people easily, regardless of if they were deaf or had the ability to hear. And that led to my first internship at Tether's Unlimited, which is a small accounting office that focuses on aerospace in Seattle. And I was involved in the project there. And the goal was to develop a small rocket for satellites. It was CubeSats for short. So we had H2 and O2. And at that time, doing that first experiment, I was able to learn a couple things. I learned that to be good, you need to have some way of communicating with others, whether that's online or through the intranet. The intranet was how I was able to communicate with my colleagues. I was also utilizing text messaging and various app programs to communicate.
I actually remember during my PhD studies communicating with other members of the lab and using paper towels to handwrite notes back and forth, using the whiteboard and different tools. And now we just have smartphones and people can use that to communicate.
Yeah, I had to do the same thing. And now there are times where I'll use Google Live Transcribe on my phone to communicate. So spoken English can be transcribed into text. Apurva?
Yes, there were actually several employment barriers I experienced through my career journey. I actually worked for an organization for 21 years and I experienced many frustrations. I will say some were positive, but many were negative. The important thing during my experience was that I had good interpreters. The aerospace organization I worked for required interpreters that had a technical knowledge base. They had to have those skills in the interpretation. When folks were speaking with me, the interpreters had to be able to use the technical language in order to facilitate communication. And then as I signed back to the hearing individual, the interpreter had to be able to follow using the same technical language. So the interpreter, there was also the culture, the tech culture, the terminology. And actually, in fact, I had one interpreter with me for, I'd say almost 20 years. And most of the interpreter pool stayed with me for a while, which meant they knew the terminology and the content in and out. But there were still communication barriers outside of that. And the use of written English, it was tough for me. I grew up with ASL and PSE and really no direct access to English. So as I advanced in my career, you really have to have higher level English writing skills. You have to be able to write clearly and concisely. You have to have that understanding of hearing culture and the way in which it functions. So as I advanced in my career, having those above me looking to me to have advanced English skills was a barrier. There were some times where, my English wasn't perfect, but it's a process of learning. And I would say the last employment barrier was knowing the people in the organization and the organization itself. So, for example, hearing and deaf cultures are very different, right? I had to respect the hearing culture and do things like working quietly in a shared office space, and them respecting deaf culture. They didn't learn sign language, but maybe learning bits and pieces here and there helped to break the communication barrier.
Yeah, Apurva, I completely agree about the written English. You know, for me, growing up, I would write English very well, and I always thought that would go on to help me in academia and in the industry that I wanted to work in.
Vicky, would you like to add?
Yes, for me, I had three different barriers that I can recall. One, which is pretty obvious, you know, communication, right? Oftentimes I would have situations where I would be stuck because of communication barriers. Growing up, whenever I would use spoken English, other hearing people would notice that I had a kind of deaf accent or it's difficult to make out what I was saying. And they would have to really approach me and come closer to understand what I was saying. And then lip reading was a barrier. And oftentimes lip reading is more of a guessing game than an actual science. I didn't really know American Sign Language until I was 26. So I guess you could say I was a fairly new student to ASL, and I strive to overcome those communication barriers. I would stand up for myself and inform people how to best communicate with me, how to best address me, and whether that's, you know, lip reading or writing back and forth. So I would be sure to communicate and be proactive. Another barrier I consider to be more of an invisible type. And what I mean by that is that there were people who maybe be apprehensive to approach me or perhaps unwilling to hire me. So if I can give you an example, as a deaf person, if you're not hired, typically they would say someone else had a better resume, which is fine, and that happens. But there's also the possibility that your potential employer is worried about your ability to work, your ability to communicate, but they never actually tell you that directly. And you can't fix what you don't know. So, how you go about overcoming that barrier, at least for me in the interview, I said, hey, you know, these are the ways that I communicate. And I know that you may be worried about my potential, but I would rather be, you know, upfront in terms of how I can go about resolving some of those concerns. You know, and I wouldn't want them to worry about potential lawsuit or anything like that. I would just be very direct and upfront about it and tell them that it's okay. So I would take the time to explain that. And then the third barrier that I like to share, not so much based on hearing so much, but self-limitation. We know that there are situations where others, you know, feel pity for us as deaf people. And there are times where we may internalize that. We may feel as though we're inferior or not good enough. It's just using myself as an example. When I started college, you know, I thought to myself, what goals do I have? And I wanted to be realistic in establishing my goals, understanding that I'm deaf, and at the time thought that I wouldn't be able to communicate effectively. I was in computer science, and the reason for that is because, you know, I thought that at one point down the road, if my boss needed me to code or to do something, I can complete that task independently without needing to rely on communication with other people. So essentially, being able to work by myself. And that is what kind of shaped my goal to work in computer science. But in reality, in college, you know, there's various group projects that you need to be on and you need to have team meetings. And I would have meetings with hearing people. It was at that moment that I decided to, you know, believe in myself and advocated for myself in terms of how I need to communicate. From there, I decided to change my major to mechanical engineering. And I do enjoy coding, but I think I love designing and analyzing um, buildings and mechanical engineering far much more.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a follow-up question on that from the audience. Regarding highly qualified interpreters, those that understand technical terminology, How do you screen them and invite them to become a part of your interpreter pool? In addition to that, how do you end up keeping them with you potentially full time instead of having multiple contract interpreters?
Understood. So your question is about the interpreters. The organization that I worked with had a contract with one specific interpreting agency that would provide interpreting services. And the interpreters that would work with me would either be contract interpreters for those agencies or that particular agency, or a full-time staff interpreter for that agency. And our organization decided to solely contract with that particular interpreting agency. There are ways to have long-term contracts with interpreting agencies. And I was also very particular about what interpreters I'd want to work with. And generally speaking, I wouldn't mind working with a new interpreter, new to me, as a way to kind of assess where they are and to also orient them to the jargon and terminology that's extremely specialized. And it was a learning process. And once they retain that information, I would decide on keeping that interpreter. If I found that an interpreter that I would try to orient wasn't able to retain the high level jargon, then I would essentially decline to have them as my go-to interpreter. And oftentimes there were moments where the interpreter may have misinterpreted what I was stating in English. And at the time, many of my employers knew that I knew what I was talking about, but the reality was that due to the lack of experience, some interpreters weren't able to adequately put my signing into spoken English.
Sure. And I'll add to that. In school, I actually studied in several different schools and I've had many different interpreters through agencies and many different agencies. So if I receive an interpreter that I'm not happy with, I will ask for a different interpreter. There have been times that I've had interpreters stay with me, several interpreters throughout the entire journey.
For me, I definitely used interpreters far more recently.
Okay. Next question for our panelists. Do you have any suggestions for colleagues or employees that may want to work with their deaf and hard of hearing colleagues?
I would recommend investing in software specifically focused on communication. So that could be an app like Slack or any other communication platform. Google Live Transcribe is something you can download on your phone, which is pretty similar in terms of the ability to communicate with others.
For me, I would say teach them some ASL. And this is my suggestion because for many years, I taught my coworkers, I would say 4 or more years, I taught them and they became conversational with me. So teaching them makes communication access easier, and it doesn't have to be at a fluent level. It just needs to be at a conversational level, and that helps to increase cross-employment collaboration. It provides that opportunity. It also shares ASL culture and deaf culture, right? So if they're curious as to how to better understand deaf people and deaf culture, then I can share my perspective with them, which I feel is important. I mean, you can write notes back and forth. You can have an interpreter come in. The important thing is to have that direct socialization opportunity, going out to lunch, chit-chatting. The more direct, the better.
And I'd also like to add that there's no need to be apprehensive. A lot of people are unsure of how to approach deaf people, and that really actually builds an invisible wall. So think about ways that you can work together. Don't be, fearful or apprehensive when it comes to approaching a deaf person or a deaf colleague. If you work together, then ask questions, develop that rapport. You can learn ASL, you can use an interpreter, you can write back and forth. The key is just to put in an effort to communicate with your deaf colleagues, and you'd be surprised to find out, how many people are worried about offending someone else. And don't let that become, a barrier to your ability to connect with your deaf colleagues. For you employers and companies out there, try your best to connect with those that work in your organization.
But you don't have interpreters with you all day, right? Apurva?
I actually have a lot of meetings on a daily basis, and I see my interpreter every single day. So there's numerous meetings that we're working together, and I'll even ask the interpreter to, come into my office on a daily basis.
But what about water cooler talk? You don't
That's a
typically
little
have
different.
you don't have an interpreter tagging along with you everywhere you go.
Right, right. I wish I did, but I would say that the biggest challenge is that it's difficult to really get an interpreter to be, a part of the water cooler talk to understand what's being said.
My group, my experience is very, very different. It's a very small group. So we do really well using the communication software apps.
I definitely use captioning in meetings, but for water cooler chats, sometimes I'll use my, spoken English. There are times where, I meet new people because I work in a pretty big organization, and I'll kind of give them an explainer on Def 101, how to, interact with deaf colleagues at work and what's appropriate and culturally acceptable and things like that.
Okay. Next question. How can employers leverage deaf gain in their recruitment processes and the workplace? I'll give you a moment to percolate on that one.
When it comes to deaf gain, I think there's two ways that could be achieved. The first is through recruitment. By hosting recruitment events, that's a key move that will help in deaf gain, but you also need to make sure that you consider the level of accessibility that you're providing. There may potentially be a large number of deaf people at these recruitment events, and if you'd like to get them to work there, it would behoove you to have interpreters present, and that's something that could definitely lead to deaf gain. I would encourage your companies to think about communication access and prioritize that at recruitment events. Another consideration for how to achieve deaf gain is to check in with your deaf employees and make sure that you're removing all barriers that they experience on the job. If you want them to work at their best or optimal level, then you need to remove the barriers that they're facing.
If I may add, there is strong evidence that deaf people have much better visual spatial reasoning capabilities. So if their employment requires the use of such capabilities or spatial distortion, awareness, and manipulation, it's a great group. Hiring deaf people for the job is a good way to go. I guess everything else is equal otherwise.
It's funny, when it comes to disabilities, a large number of those that are unemployed actually identify as disabled. And oftentimes different perspectives are at play. When it comes to deaf gain, you need to consider that a positive to your company by bringing in deaf employees to better improve your levels of diversity, because that will go on to benefit the company. You may not realize that there are people with different perspectives that may be deaf that are able to solve problems that otherwise you may not have solved. in an Astro space flight that I did a couple of years ago, we came up with a flashing light that would help alert deaf individuals or astronauts to know when turbulence was incoming. In that case, it was very noisy when turbulence would happen, and hearing people would be able to know that turbulence is afoot. But for deaf employees, that flashing light was instrumental. So there were there was multiple benefits to that. Another thing that I'd like to point out is that oftentimes there's subconscious bias. Without realizing, you may be biased in how you evaluate someone else's performance. Sometimes bias can skew how you view potential employees or applicants and how you see resumes. So it is critical that you are mindful of potential bias and you account for that when it comes to your evaluations and screening people for the job. Additionally, in the workplace, like Vicky and Eric stated, I think deaf gain is something that can be a huge boost to the workplace. The key is for you to identify how you can best achieve the deaf employee reaching their maximum potential. Because ultimately, the better they do, a rising tide lifts all ships. And for employers and employees, communication is critical. You want to make sure that there's transparency, frequent communication, and by doing so, you're using that gain to allow everyone in the organization to be more successful.
I'd like to add something, a brief comment about deaf gain. In my workspace, meetings can sometimes become a little heated, right? People can go back and forth, perhaps begin yelling. One time I was in a meeting and it was my own meeting. I was hosting it. And just prior to the meeting, I let folks know, hey, I'm deaf, one person at a time, right? Because when multiple people are speaking simultaneously, it disrupts the captioning and then the captioning is unclear and I'm unable to follow. So turn taking during the meeting. And then what happened? That meeting was so clear and simple and went so well. Once the meeting was done, another colleague approached me and said, wow, that was the best meeting. And so now I'm thinking, maybe she's realizing now that it's better if you think before you speak, and that alters the course of the way things go. That meeting went so well. It was good, it was productive, and it was just a very simple modification. It's a very simple example of how beneficial deaf gain is.
A very nice example. Agreed. It looks like there's more questions coming in from the audience, which we do appreciate. I think the question here is asking, who is your role model? What or how did what they say make an impact on your career?
I'll respond. My role model is my mom. When I was young, I really struggled in school. And while I was in school, my mom would come to me and say, you know, you really need to do better, but let me support you in that. She helped me read and work on vocabulary. She pushed me to keep working hard. She told me that if I didn't work hard, I would never meet and surpass what everyone else was doing. And I would respond, you know, it's a lot. It's a lot of information. It's a lot of vocabulary. It's a lot of all of it. But she continued to support me. And then many people out there that I've encountered are impressed by how well I've done, by how high I've made it in an aerospace organization, regardless even of the fact that I'm deaf. So I could have just been complacent and worked a lower level job, but my mom believed in me. She told me constantly that I could do more and that I should do more. So I valued her so much. She was a tremendous impact on my life.
Yeah, the same is true for my mom. She was always very encouraging of me. Heather Whitestone, which you might be surprised to know, who was Miss America at one time, or a winner and a beauty contestant, um, didn't actually, I'd never actually cared about Miss America personally, but when I saw a deaf person be crowned as Miss America, that was an inspirational moment. Again, I never really cared for beauty pageants at all, but I was just so inspired to see that. Seeing deaf representation in the media is something that's really important. And for me, I was really impressed by that. It really inspired me to believe that deaf people can do anything that they set their mind to. So that was definitely a role model that was inspirational for me. And if you know me, you know that I'm not a girly girl. Growing up, I was always a tomboy as a kid. So you may be surprised to know that that beauty contestant winner was one of my sources of inspiration.
Eric, any role models, anything that helped motivate or inspire you to get to where you are?
I'm having a hard time answering that question because I really didn't have a wonderful relationship with my family. So I'd rather not go into the details on that. Um, but I can say that that's something that definitely motivated to do better academically.
Right. Still very important. Thank you. One term that I see brought up very often is imposter syndrome. The idea that I'm here because I'm deaf and not as a result of what I can contribute, right? And we have to constantly tell ourselves to ignore that little voice. Next question, I think, is best as the last question. So I'm going to hold that one. But next question for our panelists. How many people do you supervise or have working under you? And what are the challenges that go along with it?
So this isn't so much of a supervisory perspective, but more of a team lead perspective. There are several people that I have in my team that work under me, and they operate spacecrafts, and what I tell them to do essentially gets communicated to the scientists and contributes to the data collection overall. So I think some of the challenges, with communication, I think that's actually a loaded question because there's so much that comes to mind. I think at the top of the list is certainly communication. It's not always easy to understand information, especially when you're working through an interpreter. And I'm evaluating whether or not the interpretation was accurate. And personally, I'm the type to ask questions until I can verify that I completely understand the topic of discussion. So I'll ask others to be patient with me. And I also understand that not everyone is that way. And some people may feel overwhelmed when they're asked so many questions, but I do take it one step at a time in order to confirm my understanding. I think sometimes not having information in a visual way can be a little bit of impediment in how quickly you can understand what's being communicated. But going back to my point, with those that work with me or in my team, respect is something that's shared among the group. And I don't think there's any ill feelings or disgruntled, team members because their team lead is deaf. But I do think that there are times where others may question the abilities of deaf people and what they're actually able to do. And I find it important to, show to others that, I walk the walk. And, I can actually accomplish, what I set my mind to and complete the tasks that are assigned to me despite any potential doubt.
As a team lead, my team is comprised of about 20 people. And I've been in this role about 2 years now, so it's fairly recent for me. Now, when I first began in this role, everyone was new to me. I mean, I knew a few of them, but almost everyone was new to me and I to them. So we didn't have that comfortable relationship, that bond. It was new for all of us, and that was a challenge. And I'm sure everybody was thinking, oh, I have to work for a new person, and this person is deaf. I have to report to them. I'm sure some folks felt awkward about it. So I really had to put myself out there and interact with them. It was really important for us to have connections. We don't need to be best friends, but we do need to be able to work together. So it's important to me that I'm ensuring their needs are met so that they can perform their jobs well. That is my responsibility as their team lead. So I work very hard to ensure that that happens. Some of us understand one another very well, and others don't. And if there is a misunderstanding or any sort of difficulty, I will communicate in a different way. I will try the best I can to make that connection, to really accommodate them. We're here to work together. And I just keep that in mind. It's all about having those relationships.
Awesome. Eric, anything else you'd like to add?
Yes. So again, I work in a very small team and I don't supervise anyone, but I do make communication a top priority. That's because we all have so much we can learn from one another. I'm more of a theoretical person. Other folks on my team are more of the hands-on expertise. They know a lot about the mechanics and that aspect of the work. I have a lot to learn from them. They have a lot to learn from me. And communication is absolutely a top priority for that reason.
Okay, another question from the audience. What advice do you have for job seekers who are deaf or hard of hearing that are currently seeking employment and coming across potential employment barriers?
My advice for those folks would really be to just leverage any opportunity. Internships, for example. Internships are a great way for organizations to test drive potential employees, right? It's an opportunity for you to prove you have the ability. So internships. Also, always look for new experiences. You know, some people are involved in camps like engineering camps, robotics camps. Do that sort of thing. Learn as much as you can. The more things you do, the more a potential employer will see on your resume, on your CV. Look at all the things this interviewee has done. So I would say leverage opportunities.
I think a lot of these companies are focused more so on skill sets and your critical thinking ability. Furthermore, I would say that English is critical. And out of those three, I think teamwork is something I like to add as well. The world that we live in is becoming far more globalized, and we need to be able to work with different people. It used to be the case where you may work with one or two people, whereas now you're working with countless individuals, and you need to be able to be adaptable. You can't just work alone. So I think communication is key. If you're looking for a specific job, you want to make sure that the skill sets you possess are actually well suited to the job you're looking for. So critical thinking, teamwork, communication. Those are just a few of the qualities that you'll need. And I also want to say, don't give up. The opportunities are bountiful. And, there are people who are not only deaf, but also hearing that may struggle to find gainful employment in their first couple of years. Don't give up. If you're facing obstacles, reach out to your colleagues, reach out to your, alumni organization, reach out to vocational rehab support services who can help identify strategies to take down some of those obstacles. And if you're not able to get your dream job right away, that's okay. Find a stepping stone job that you can then be able to transition from, which will take you closer to your dream job. The key is really developing and building your experience so that eventually when there's an opening for your dream job, you've got a built up experience and resume that you can use to your leverage, which will then help you into the workforce in your ideal kind of field or dream job that you're looking for. And most importantly, I forgot to mention this, network, network, network. You want to make sure that you're networking with people in the field. You want to make sure that you're networking with friends, colleagues. Oftentimes, your network is what leads to your greatest opportunities. So keep in mind any friends you have, all of your alumni, make sure that you're in touch with people because networking is one of the keys to success.
All of this advice is great. I'd like to add, if possible, having personal projects that have to do with your internship or the potential internship you want to be involved in. That's how I came across my first internship. I made my own personal project and presented it to the organization to show them I had the capability. And if they're impressed, they'll hire you. That's what happened.
Pretty cool. Another question from the audience. Do you have deaf colleagues at your place of work? And if you don't, why not? This could be a great opportunity to push for more. Would you agree?
I can comment for at the moment. I'm currently the only deaf employee in my workspace. And across my studies, I've only really met very few deaf individuals in engineering, most in physics and engineering. So through my career, I would say I only really know of a few deaf individuals in the engineering field.
At my place of employment, we have 10 deaf employees, and I believe 3 or 4 are engineers, software engineers, and the rest of the team is in the accounting department. So overall, I would say that there's a large number of deaf employees at this one place of employment in Maryland, and there are other satellite offices or branches in the area. But overall, the organization does a great job with recruitment, but they need to do more. I think the previous management that was in place was really instrumental in the hiring of more deaf employees. They weren't initially familiar with deaf employees. They would just focus on those with disabilities that perhaps were blind or wheelchair users, but they weren't really familiar with deaf and hard of hearing. So we took the time to kind of educate them, and it was a great opportunity to share the value. And then ultimately, that's what led to them hiring more deaf and hard of hearing people.
And for me, Apurva and I work in the same organization. All the centers in total, last I'd heard, had over 100 deaf and hard of hearing individuals. I'm trying to think of the location I'm in. I know we have 4 deaf and hard of hearing, 2 are engineers, 1 is in equipment management, and the 4th is in the legal arena. So 4 deaf and hard of hearing people in this office. There may be more I'm unaware of. My center also has a work group for people with disabilities. And we are trying to hire more employees with disabilities. That's part of the goal. This includes policy work, determining best recruitment practices. And in response, I do think we need more. We always need more deaf and hard of hearing employees. So to that end, I try to encourage myself to do more.
It looks like there's a comment from the audience stating that they want to thank the panel for sharing their experience. And this is an excellent example for students to follow and learn from. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
What message do you have for audience members? What would you like to impart on them? If you could sum it up into an impactful statement, what would that be? Vicky, go for it. And then afterwards, Eric, if that's okay. Okay, so Vicky and then Eric.
Sure. I'll keep it simple. You will face challenges and barriers. That's the reality of life. The important thing is to persevere. I cannot encourage you enough to find ways around those barriers and obstacles. Find a way to just keep on target and keep working to your goal. Sometimes it's a workaround. Sometimes it means adjusting your goals. But it's important to have perseverance in life and to just find a way through or around those barriers.
Yeah, I second what Vicky said. I can totally agree with that.
I have 3 simple thoughts to share. First and most important is don't give up. That is key. Do not give up. When you face frustrations and barriers, as the 3 of us have shared with you, we've all talked about our challenges and obstacles we faced. But the important thing is to remember, don't give up. And then be curious. And the reason I say this is the greater curiosity you have about things around you, the more you learn about those things around you. And the more that assists you in your career. So be curious. Don't just be curious about things you see in front of you or in your workspace. Be curious about other things as well. Don't stay in your comfort zone. Step out of it and be curious. Also, value your work. If you don't value your work, you won't find happiness and you won't succeed. Value your work and it will impact what you do in the future.
Wonderful. Well, we have around 5 minutes left. I apologize to the audience members whose questions have we haven't been able to answer. It's difficult to decide on which one to pick. I think we should end on a positive note. Wouldn't you agree? What would you say has been your proudest achievement for you in the workplace?
Oof. I'll begin.
Apurva? Yeah, go for it.
Okay. I used to work as a propulsion engineer. And in that work, we would design and build propulsion systems for spacecraft.
Propulsion systems. Okay.
So propulsion systems for spacecraft. And my proudest achievement was looking at all the pieces and putting them all together and having my product sent off into space. I had become an engineer. I had designed and created something and my product was in space. That was my proudest achievement.
That's pretty cool. And for me, there are 2 of my proudest moments. One is the SLS successfully taking off. And that was a project that took around 8 years. Propulsion was a key component. Structural integrity was another. So that was one. And then the second, and I chuckle a little bit, around 10 years ago, I was responsible to develop a code for a simulation model. And I was there to essentially test the temperature pressure. So that's what my code did. And once I completed that task, my coworker had the same task with a different model, and our eyes were completely different. And the two of us debated who was right and who was wrong. And this debate, believe it or not, lasted a whole week, and going through the explanation of why we made the decision we made. And then eventually we figured out that there was an inaccurate assumption that was made. And I was so happy to find that out. And now I'm able to develop models that are in alignment with, my coworker. And, it's kind of weird to see that as a success, but I think there are many projects similar to that where you work so hard and so diligently to figure a problem out. And then that feeling of euphoria once you're able to get to that solution is really indescribable.
I've had several personal projects that I have great pride on. Filmography for my team for these systems during my internship experiences, doing my own films. And then a personal project that I'm working on in the University of Northern Florida. It's a hardware product, and we're currently in the development phase, building it out now. I know I don't have much time, so I can't go into greater detail, but that's that. Thank you.
Well, I have to contract you to build me out a rover and take it on the trails. Well, thank you so much to our panelists. We are appreciative of your time and your willingness to share your remarks with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And again, we will be sharing resources after today's presentation to all that have registered. Thank you for your time. Thank you for attending. And also, I'd like to thank our sponsors, NAD, CSD, RID, NTID, and Gallaudet University. Thank you all for your support in making this happen. And lastly, thank you to all our panelists today.
Thank you for the honor.